practice. And so it has a special meaning to all of us. I titled my sermon today, Rest. It's one of my favorite four-letter words. And I'm reading from Matthew 11, verses 28 and 29. And you can read along with me on the board. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. What I'm hoping to do this morning is to have you gain a better understanding of what Jesus is trying to say in these two texts. And I will attempt to do that by discussing two things that are directly in contrast with each other: burden and rest. I looked at the historical context of these two verses, and I found that there were a group of Jews who encouraged the new Jewish converts to keep all the traditions of the elders, as well as the ceremonial law, also known as the law of Moses. And these types of traditions that the Jews had practiced for centuries were becoming very, very burdensome. And besides, they were done away with when Jesus was crucified at the cross. And so Jesus spoke out about this, about these traditions that these Jewish people spoke about, and encouraged the new converts to exercise. Well, let me give you an example of a burden. In Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 10, there's the story about these Jews who directly imposed these traditions on the new converts that were converted by Paul and Barnabas on their missionary journeys. I guess today we would call them Jewish Christians. And they stated that in order to be fully accepted as Jews, they needed to follow the ceremonial law, more specifically, circumcision. And this was directly in opposition of what Paul and Barnabas stated on their missionary journeys. I read from Acts 13, 38, 39. Here we go. Acts 13, 38 through 39. This is what Paul and Barnabas' position was when they were going on their missionary journeys. Whereby Jesus we are justified in all things, by which we are not justified by the law of Moses. Verse 39. And by him all that believe are justified from all things, from which we could not be justified by the law of Moses. I just repeated myself. And in Galatians 2, verse 16, well, I'm just going to have to read it from the board here. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. And here comes his famous statement, by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Well, this was such a controversial issue that the church in Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas to the church in Jerusalem to convene on this matter and talk about it with the elders and the apostles. Now, this issue is not just a simple issue This issue is not something that could be simply agreed or disagreed on. It's actually a salvational issue. So when Paul and Barnabas arrived in Jerusalem, there was this, I guess you could say, a general conference meeting where they were going to discuss where Christians were saved by faith alone, or a combination of faith and following the law of Moses. In other words, is the work that Jesus has done sufficient to save one who trusts in him, or are added works necessary to be saved? I'm glad to say that the matter was resolved in Acts 15, verse 11. We believe, this is Paul's position, we believe that we shall be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus in like manner as they. So, Jesus issued this promise because he's offering a new and a better way to worship. You know, he wanted to do away with the traditions, the rites, and the ceremonies. And he offered this promise so that we can more accurately see what he is really like. You know, someone who promises to show you how to ultimately live a life and be free from all the burdens that Satan, our society, and we ourselves impose on us. You might say that this example is an example at the corporate level. But when Jesus actually spoke these words, were they primarily spoken to those who could only hear them? If he was in a city square, were they spoken to the beggars, the rich person, the child, those who were religiously oppressed, those who were politically oppressed? Well, the answer to these questions has to be a yes. So I'm going to personalize this text, and I'm going to act like he's directly talking to me, you know. So, what does it mean to labor and be heavy laden? According to one theologian, to labor implies that the burdens we put on ourselves, and to be heavy laden implies burdens that are put on others. You know, I think that probably covers all the burdens that Jesus addresses in this text. Rest is simply release from that labor and being heavy laden. Now, in Seventh-day Adventist circles, the word rest is always associated, well, mostly associated with the Sabbath commandment. In that commandment, you know, God encourages us not to be gainfully employed, but rather to join our brothers and sisters in fellowship and worship him. He says that in 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, and on the seventh day just enjoy the rest. Earlier this week I read about the rest test that was circulated online. Did anybody happen to see that? What it attempted to do was investigate activities that people engage in to obtain rest. Something like 18,000 people from 134 countries participated in this online survey. And the survey listed a number of activities, and they were asked to list a top 3 number of activities. And this is what the survey came out with. Okay. You can see that the number one activity in which people gained rest was reading. It's close to 60%. And followed by being in the natural environment, spending time alone, listening to music, and doing nothing in particular. There's something unique about the first 3 And you can also apply it to the first 5, and that these activities are always done alone, or usually done alone. And the next slide shows they were polled. 31% said no, they're happy with the amount of rest that they're getting. And more than 2/3 of the 18,000 people said yes, they would like more rest. When we go back to the previous one, could it be that to gain rest, people need to be by themselves? And that's an easy deduction to make when you look at the percentages. Well, when they controlled this survey for the extroverts and the introverts, the ratings didn't change. The extroverts, people who gain energy from being among others, rated these things almost the same compared to the introverts. Those are people that tend to be by themselves or prefer to be by themselves. So, what I think would really be interesting is that we could see a poll which lists the types of burdens that people seek rest from. The type of burden, the burden that Jesus talked about in the text, has to be a burden that affects everyone. It has to be a universal burden, And so that burden has to come from within. I say that the number one burden that people carry is the burden of pride. I'm not talking about pride of doing a job well done. I'm talking about the kind of pride that God hates. The kind of pride that comes from self-righteousness. Well, let me give you a quick example. Most of you know I do landscaping for people. And I had a customer who had a tree removed, and underneath that tree was a huge bed of hostas, and hostas like shade and lots of moisture. Well, when the tree was cut down, it exposed these hostas to the sun, which will be very detrimental to them, so she asked me to transplant them. And I dug up 30 plants, and they have deep roots, and I planted them in a scalloped fashion. And when she saw what I had done, she said, "Ed, you did a really good job." I was proud of that. That is not the kind of pride that the Bible talks about that God hates. In Proverbs 8:13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance, and the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. And in Isaiah 14:12 through 15, states that Satan was cast out of heaven as a result of pride. Let's go to the next slide here. Oops. Ezekiel 28, verse 17 lists the exact reason why Satan was cast out of heaven, and I've given 3 different translations here. The New Living Translation says, "Your heart was filled with pride," or with beauty. The English Standard Version says, "Your heart was proud because of your beauty." And the New King James Version says, "Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty." The next slide, Psalms 101:5. "Whoever slanders his neighbor, secretly I will destroy. Whoever has a haughty look and an arrogant heart, I will not endure." Now, what does the word haughty look mean? Does anybody have an idea of what the words haughty look means? Okay. Well, the dictionary describes it as blatantly and disdainfully proud. You know, that means everything revolves around me. I'm only concerned about me. I'm not concerned about you. I'm not concerned about the will of God. Everything, the whole world, revolves around me. In Mark 7, verses 21 through 23, for from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, theft, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile a man. So, pride comes from the heart and defiles a person. And why does God hate pride? Because it makes that person thinks he's better than anybody else. You know, followers of Jesus were asked to be servants. And a proud person can never answer that call. You know, the Bible also gives us examples of godly people who are not immune to pride. In 2 Chronicles, Uzziah went into the temple to burn incense, which was only allowed to be done by the priests of the tribe of Levi. And as a result, Uzziah, who was a godly king, was struck with leprosy. Hezekiah's pride in his earthly possessions brought God's discipline on him. You can read about that in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. And we all have heard about Peter's prideful statements that he would never deny Jesus, but he did. Not once, but 3 times. And so, you know, these examples of pride are burdens that we carry in our life, and we really shouldn't have to. You know, and a proudful person also protects themselves against criticism. You know, I dislike it when somebody says something bad about me, and I protect myself. I do that by making myself better than that person who criticized me, you know. And, you know, when you carry this with you for decades, it begins to gnaw on you. You know, it's an unnatural lifestyle that you shouldn't have to carry. So what's the solution to overcoming the burden of pride, that haughty look, you know, being disdainful, seeing yourself better than others? Jesus calls us to rest, and meekness is his method. Another necessary burden that we carry through the years is the problem of pretending. Quite simply, pretending is being hypocritical is simply claiming to be someone that you are not, or claiming to believe something in a matter that's contrary to the belief. You know, when I was a younger man, I started dating when I was 17 or 18 years old. It was sort of late in life, or late in the teenage years. And looking back now, I can remember intentionally deceiving the girl I was dating. You know, I could run faster, and you know, I was much nicer than I really was. I wanted to make an impression on her so that she would reciprocate and like me. I look back at it now, well, some of you might say, well, that's just the innocence of youth and inexperience in life. But in truth, I intentionally deceived her to make myself better. You know. Hypocrisy and pretending is not limited to a romancing teenager, because it continues well into adult life. There isn't a man or woman in this congregation that doesn't want to make a more favorable impression on others. We all want to do that. How do we do that? We do it by pretending. You know, and then there isn't a rich man in all of his wealth and his attire and his house and his cars that isn't afraid that somebody with more wealth would come along and make him look like a pauper. You know, talk about pretending. We're in an election year this year. Since day one, all these politicians, you know, have pretended to be somebody that they really aren't. You can make up your own opinion when you look at somebody and see what they say, and is that parallels with who they really are. Now, so what does the Bible say about pretending? Isaiah 29:13, the Lord said, "Inasmuch as these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught as commandments of men." Jesus looked at a crowd of people and said that. They apparently knew how to talk the spiritual talk, but they didn't know how to walk the spiritual walk. You cannot tell a person's heart from what they say. You cannot tell a person's heart from what they do. Only God can do that. The only way you can tell where a person's heart is by looking at the whole life and by their fruits. The Bible teaches that. By their fruits you will know them. A few hundred years later, Jesus addressed hypocrisy in Matthew 15, verse 8. And he was quoting Isaiah. "These people draw near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." Jesus was condemning the scribes and the Pharisees when they were debating him about the traditions of the elders and making these traditions commandments. You must do this in order to follow Jesus and to receive salvation. There's an amusing illustration that Jesus used to describe hypocrisy, and it's found in Matthew 7, verses 3 through 5. "And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." You know, a speck and a plank are tangible objects, you know. And Jesus used these objects to make the illustration somewhat memorable, somewhat entertaining. Can you picture somebody with a board in his eye, you know, trying to help a friend who has a speck in his eye? There is a sense of humor about this in some aspects, and it's pretty serious in others. This illustration shows that, you know, you have your own sins to concern about before you can help others. You know, it's like somebody trying to correct the sin in someone else, all the while not admitting that he has the same sins or even greater, and he earns the label hypocrite. Quite often people who are hypocritical are unaware of their own sins, or at least are more tolerant of their own sins. There's a story in 2 Samuel 12 where Nathan the prophet told David a story about a rich man who stole a sheep from a poor man and slaughtered the sheep for a feast. David was very, very quick to condemn that man, only realizing later on that Nathan was addressing David directly. You can read about it in 2 Samuel 12. So, the process of being hypocritical or pretending, having pride, are burdens that we should not have to carry. These are burdens that come from within and can just eat away at your soul. Just think for 1 minute, if anyone who is burdened with hypocrisy for years and years and years can live a natural way of life. It's almost impossible. Jesus has a very effective way to counteract these burdens and the way with which people live. He says you must become like little children. They don't really concern themselves with comparing with what they have with others. They receive direct enjoyment with who they are without relating themselves to somebody else. And it's not until they get older that jealousy sets in and they become burdened with such pretenses. Jesus offers rest from these burdens, and he does it through meekness. Now, our culture today has a lot of problems with being meek. It often associates being meek with being weak. We define strong people as those who are assertive. They take charge. They're proud, they're self-sufficient, they're self-reliant, and they're independent. And a meek person is just the opposite of these traits. They're humble, they're long-suffering, they're gentle, they're submissive. These are not the type of characteristics that our society values. But I can't think that God wants us to be too compliant. He doesn't want us to be too submissive, because we know that Moses was a very meek person, but he also broke the tables of stone. Moses also defied God's command to speak to a stone to produce water. Jesus was a very meek person. Jesus cleaned out the temple not once but twice. Can you see a submissive, humble, gentle, meek person doing that? One theologian described the meek as somebody who can be angry but restrain their anger but still be obedient to God's will, and will not be angry unless they can be angry and not sin. Another theologian described meekness as the men who suffer wrong without bitterness or desire for revenge. To be meek means to show willingness to submit and work under proper authority. It also shows a willingness to disregard one's own rights and privileges. In the famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So what's your attitude towards meekness? Are we going to be among the ones to inherit the earth? How do you conduct your life on a day-to-day basis? In Galatians 5:22 and 23, meekness is listed as one of the fruits of the Spirit. So, we know that These fruits of the spirits are based in love. And that in order to love our person, we have to love our neighbors. We have to be patient. We have to exhibit joy. We have to be friendly. We have to be temperate. We have to have strong faith in Jesus because he's the only source of meekness. I've given several biblical examples of meekness. I have one that's a contemporary example. Let's suppose a Hamid trip home which usually takes 30 minutes, took an hour and a half, and his commute was essentially like a moving parking lot. And he gets home, and Salome, who doesn't drive yet, says, "Dad, I need to go to Alandi's house. I need to be there in 10 minutes. You need to take me right now because Mom's not here." Well, Hamid is known to be kind and understanding and patient, and he says, "I have to unload the car. I have to freshen up. We'll leave for Alandi's house in 10 minutes. But Dad, I need to go right now." She asserts her position. And Hamid says, "Please call Alandi and let her know that we're going to be leaving in 10 minutes. And that we're going to be about 10 minutes late." In this situation, Hamid exercises control. He's patient. He's firm. And he's a godly example for Salome. This is an excellent example where he and Salome can both practice the attitude of meekness. Let me give you one more example in closing. Many of you who drive can identify with this. You've often seen people on the highway that drive as though the highway is their own personal racetrack. They cut people off, they speed, they brake unnecessarily, and they generally cause disruptions to this flow of traffic. But let's suppose that a car whips by you and barely misses you, and a mile down the road, this car is involved in a major accident. My human nature would say, good, he's got what he deserves. A meek person, a person with meekness about him would have moved over when he saw him in his rearview mirror and allowed that driver to pass slowly. He would have come to the accident, he would have called Highway Patrol or 911, and then determine if he could be of assistance to that person. A meek person would not have prejudged that driver because he did not know if there was a medical situation, a stroke, a heart attack that would have caused that accident. God invites us to bring pride, to bring hypocrisy, to bring pretending to him. He does that through offering rest, which is done through meekness. Meekness is a fruit of the Spirit, and it's based on love for others. Jesus lived as an example of meekness, and it would be good for us to follow him, follow that example. For against such things there is no law. It was my intention, let me backtrack just a minute. This quarter we're studying the book of Job, or not the book of Job, but we're studying Job. And it's not until the very end where the lesson has to do about Job's character. When you study this lesson, pay attention to Job's meekness, for he is an example of a meek person who trusts, and he's in a situation in which he has no control, but he continues to trust God for rest. Thank you.